thank you all for coming this afternoon. I want to give my particular appreciation to Clay Doobie, to Fred Notehelfer, and to Don McCallum, who I know all had a role in bringing me out to Southern California today. And it really is a thrill to be speaking so close to Hollywood about Godzilla. Please bear with me for a moment when I do something that has really no relationship necessarily to the context of what I'll be talking about today, but which sets the tone perfectly, I hope, for a talk about Godzilla. Well, back in 1985, a New York Times CBS News poll asked 1,500 Americans to name a famous Japanese person. The top three responses were Hirohito, full credit there, Bruce Lee, not even Japanese, of course, and Godzilla. Now, this is, needless to say, a stinging indictment of American public knowledge of Japan. But it is also a testament to the impact which a Japanese movie monster has had on popular culture around the globe. Godzilla is the world's oldest and longest film franchise, as well as one of Japan's most enduring and pervasive cultural exports. Godzilla's admirers are a large and varied lot, running from mild-mannered college professors in Kansas to enigmatic, bouffanted dictators in North Korea. Kim Jong-il is, as many of you know, quite a film buff, and apparently is a world-class fan of Godzilla, to the extent that he commissioned his own giant monster film entitled Pulgasari in 1985, for which he kidnapped a South Korean director and hired the Japanese stuntman who played the monster to be in that North Korean version as well. And I heartily recommend it if you haven't seen it. It is a true hoot. Godzilla must also be recognized as a pioneer of sorts, as the first creation of post-war Japanese mass culture to gain international exposure and acclaim. Godzilla paved the way in many respects for other Japanese inventions which have subsequently become ubiquitous in global pop culture. From Ultraman, Speed Racer, and the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers to Pokemon, anime, and Iron Chef. I don't really think I need to convince you of Godzilla's place in American popular culture, or his iconic association with Japan in the American popular imagination. A big, flowery Godzilla once adorned a float at the Rose Parade. The King of the Monsters has won an MTV Lifetime Achievement Award, and Mia Farrow famously declared at the Oscars that Godzilla was her favorite movie. Japanese monster films have been the subjects of tributes and parodies in American art and literature, on TV, and in Hollywood movies. All across the country, oversized cats, dogs, hamsters, and pet iguanas are named Godzilla. And then, of course, there is the ubiquitous Zilla suffix. Our society is filled with bridezillas, truckzillas, mozillas, pornzillas, and virtually every other combination you can imagine. Godzilla even turns up in some really unexpected places. Who would have thought that the National Fatherhood Initiative would have any interest in a Japanese movie lizard?
People, let me tell you about my best friend. He's a warm-hearted person who loved me till the end. People, let me tell you about him. It's so much fun, whether we're talking man to man.
You don't need to be bigger than life to be a good dad. You just need to spend time with your kids. It takes a man to be a dad.
Well, given Godzilla's status as one of the world's most recognizable, abiding, and unlikely movie stars, it is somewhat surprising how little scholarly attention this giant radiation-breathing reptile has received, either in Japan or in the West. Critics have generally judged the Godzilla films to be artistically lacking, intellectually unchallenging, and ideologically hollow. Donald Ritchie, the Dean of American Film Critics of Japan, once damned Japanese cinema as, quote, a plethora of nudity, teenage heroes, science fiction monsters, animated cartoons, and pictures about cute animals. Only a handful of scholarly essays on the King of the Monsters have appeared in English, and few, other than a terrific 1993 article by Susan Napier placing Godzilla in a tradition of dystopian science fiction, and a somewhat scattershot 1987 piece by Chon Noriega on Godzilla and nuclear fear, have even attempted to contextualize the film historically. Japanese writings on Godzilla have also been relatively sparse and generally superficial, though some recent pieces are delightfully tongue-in-cheek. Scientists have attempted to analyze Godzilla from a paleontological point of view, musing on the monster's role in the Jurassic ecosystem, while whimsical economists have attempted to tote up the property damage from the creature's rampages through Tokyo. One study estimating the losses from a single raid on the Ginza at $175 billion, give or take a few bucks. What I would like to argue for today is the modest notion that the Godzilla films can provide us with valuable insights into Japanese culture since World War II. I will not pretend that any of my observations here are particularly earth-shattering, or that my conclusions are entirely well-rooted theoretically. High theory, it seems to me, rather ruins the fun of Japanese monster movies, which is, in the end, their greatest charm. I do hope, however, that my comments will give you a better historical and cultural context for understanding the Godzilla phenomenon, and a better appreciation of what a man in a latex suit destroying toy cities can teach us about post-war Japan. Now, I'll try to keep the talk as concise as I can today. People who know me know that I can ramble on forever about Godzilla movies once I get started. But what I thought I would do is start off with some brief background on the Godzilla films, then provide an overview of the original 1954 movie, easily the most important of the series, before going on to discuss some of the significant themes which I see coming out of this first picture, as well as some of the continuities and new developments in the series over the decades. First of all, though, let's discuss some basic facts and figures. When was Godzilla invented, and under what circumstances? Well, the American monster classic King Kong, originally from 1933, was re-released in Japan in 1952. The following year, the new Warner Brothers film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, came out in Japan. Both were immediate smash hits. And this implanted the idea of giant monsters into the minds of Japanese film studios, which have never been loath to steal a good idea from Hollywood. But Godzilla's genesis was also torn from the headlines. It was conditioned by Cold War tensions and atomic age anxieties. In March of 1954, a Japanese fishing vessel, Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon number 5, if you can believe that name, strayed into the U.S. nuclear bomb testing zone near Bikini Atoll. The crew was exposed to massive amounts of radiation. One member of the crew subsequently died after a rather cynical American cover-up, and some of the irradiated tuna on the ship made it onto the market in Japan. The American government never formally apologized. Only token restitution was paid. And needless to say, this was huge news in Japan. The newspapers at the time called it the latest atomic bombing of the nation. And this was especially true, of course, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were fresh in the minds of the Japanese public. Godzilla was apparently the brainchild of a producer at Toho Studios named Tanaka Tomoyuki. And the legend goes that he had this light bulb moment as he was flying back to Japan over the South Pacific, looking out of the windows of the airliner, thinking about the next blockbuster he was going to make. The Lucky Dragon incident was floating in his mind, the success of King Kong, and he thought, what if a giant monster rose from the ocean and attacked Japan? Tanaka recruited top talent for the picture, since he intended from the start for Godzilla to be very serious fare for adults. He hired special effects wizard Tsuburaya Eiji, who had done wonderful propaganda films of Pearl Harbor, films which were so realistic that when they were captured by the American military, they at first believed they were watching newsreel footage and not special effects reconstructions. And he also hired as director Honda Ishiro, a professional who was personally committed to the anti-nuclear message of the film. He had gone through Hiroshima not long after the bombings. Needless to say, it had a very profound impact on him, and he was dedicated to making a film that was a meaningful reflection on the threat of nuclear war. Honda was also a well-known director. He was later assistant director for Kurosawa and collaborated with him on films like Kagemusha. So he had significant professional credentials as well. People often ask where the name came from. In Japan, Godzilla is Gojira. This was later rendered directly into English as Godzilla. Gojira was allegedly a nickname given to an overweight press agent at Toho Studios by cruel colleagues. Tanaka heard this nickname, he loved it, he appropriated it for his monster. And Gojira was a contraction of two Japanese words, gorira and kujira, gorilla and whale. The monster didn't turn out looking very much like either, but the name stuck. Now, Toho Studios invested a great deal in the original Godzilla film. 60 million yen, about 3 times the budget of the average Japanese movie at the time, though far less, it should be noted, than Hollywood would have spent on a run-of-the-mill B movie. Gojira opened on November 3rd, 1954. Receipts were good, 150 million yen, but it was still only the 12th largest grossing film in Japan that year. Its success, and particularly its export potential, were such, however, that a whole Godzilla franchise was born. Godzilla, King of the Monsters opened in the United States in 1956. It was a cleverly re-edited version of the Japanese original, with the unfortunate addition of Raymond Burr as a voyeuristic American reporter who witnesses the destruction of Tokyo. This version was considerably altered from the original Japanese film, notably in that all references to World War II and to the atomic bombs were removed. It was really cleaned up for American audiences. About 20 minutes of footage from the original was taken out. Another interesting fact is that this American version was subsequently subtitled in Japanese and released in Japan, where it, in turn, was very successful. The following, then, is a clip from the trailer for this Japanese release of the Americanized version.
The monsters, alive, surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror to wreak vengeance on mankind.
Godzilla, King of the Monsters, it's alive!
A gigantic beast,
Stalking the earth, crushing all before it,
in a cyclonic cavalcade of electrifying horror.
raging through the streets on a rampage of total destruction.
Godzilla, King of the Monsters,
Incredible Titan of Terror,
wiping out a city of 6 million in a holocaust of flame.
jet flames cannot destroy it.
Bombs cannot kill it.
All modern weapons fail.
Is this the end of our civilization?
If you don't want to just run out and watch that movie, there is something wrong with you. There have to date been 28 Godzilla movies produced by Toho, and just by the way, I do not count the appalling 1998 Hollywood production with Matthew Broderick, a real Godzilla film, so let us not speak of it anymore. 15 of these movies appeared between 1954 and 1975, at which point the series petered out. It was reborn, however, in 1984 after Toho recognized the continued popularity of Godzilla. 7 films were subsequently made between 84 and 95, known collectively as the Heisei Gojira series, Heisei, of course, being the reign name of the current emperor of Japan. And this run ended with 1995's Godzilla vs. Destroyer, in which Godzilla dies of an internal meltdown, a kind of radioactive heartburn. The latest run of Toho-produced films began with Godzilla 2000 Millennium, and a new film has been released annually around New Year's. A 50th anniversary blockbuster entitled Godzilla Final Wars premiered here in Los Angeles in 2004 and has proven yet another big disappointment both to fans and to Toho's box office receipts. This most recent film is said to be the last. Godzilla dies yet again. Toho said he's going on hiatus. I don't think anyone really believes that Godzilla is gone for good. He's simply too big a property. Now, as you probably all know, after the original films were made, the quality of the series declined rapidly. The serious message of the first offering was speedily junked for more crowd-pleasing fare, and the age of the target audience declined steadily. The first film was aimed firmly at an adult market, but by the 1970s, 8-year-olds were the folks Toho was aiming at. The films became more cynical money spinners, they were dumbed down, production values plummeted, and so forth. And the films really degenerated into big-time wrestling in rubber suits, a technique grandly christened suitmation by Toho. The scripts and special effects were remarkably cheesy, though at the same time also very appealingly campy. Who couldn't laugh at the King of the Monsters teaching his son how to blow radioactive smoke rings, flying on his tail, or playing volleyball using a huge boulder with a gargantuan mutant lobster? The Heisei film series of the 1980s and 1990s were intended to be more serious, to take Godzilla back for an adult audience. They generally boosted better special effects, though there were still some real laughers in these films, as well as better overall production values. Nevertheless, most scripts were still weak, and the acting was astonishingly poor at some points. The films released since 2000 have generally been quite strong, with significantly improved screenplays and some truly memorable fight sequences, but many fans still criticize them for a lack of creativity and a continued pandering to preteen audiences. And the fact that many of these recent films have been released on double bills with Hamtaro, the little Japanese sort of hamster cartoons, suggests that really adults are not going to watch them. They are meant for kids. Going back to the beginning, however, the original 1954 Gojira was, without question, the finest film of the Godzilla series, and it richly deserves the epithet classic. This first offering has not been widely available in the United States, except in pirated editions, and is different enough from the American version, Godzilla King of the Monsters, that it may be worthwhile running briefly through the plot. As many of you know, for about the past year, a new print of the film with new subtitles has been in release in the United States, and a DVD is said to be forthcoming. So hopefully this film will not be as obscure as it has been for most of the past 50 years. Well, the film Gojira begins with a clear reference to the Lucky Dragon incident. Japanese fishing boats in the South Pacific are destroyed by some mysterious and lethal force from beneath the waves. The rustic residents of nearby Odo Island believe that the boats have been destroyed by Godzilla, a legendary monster lurking in the ocean's depths. A paleontologist, Dr. Yamane, is dispatched from Tokyo and discovers that a prehistoric creature has been awakened from undersea hibernation by recent hydrogen bomb tests and is now itself radioactive. Yamane reports his findings to the Japanese parliament, the Diet, and argues that Godzilla is a scientific specimen which should be studied, not destroyed. The monster, however, has its sights set on Tokyo, and begins a series of devastating nighttime attacks that the military and civil authorities are powerless to stop. The destruction is depicted vividly and in very human terms in the film, in scenes that were certainly intended to bring to mind memories of World War II, the fire bombings of Tokyo, and of course the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the following clip shows part of Godzilla's rampage through the Ginza. Clearly here, bringing back memories of the war. The reference of the mother there clearly suggests that the father died in World War II, and now the family would be joining him. Now, one of the surprising aspects of the 1954 Gojira for many viewers is how little time the monster actually spends on screen. Not surprisingly, these special effects sequences were extremely expensive to make, so the filmmakers tried to include as little of the monster in action as they could. As much attention is given in the film to a melodramatic, sentimental subplot as to the rampages of Godzilla. This subplot focuses on a classic love triangle. Emiko, the daughter of Dr. Yamane the paleontologist, is engaged in an arranged marriage to her father's colleague, Dr. Serizawa. Emiko, however, does not love Serizawa, who has suffered greatly in World War II and bears the emotional and physical scars of the experience. Emiko instead is in love with Lieutenant Ogata, a dashing naval officer, and she is torn with guilt as she tries to tell her father and Serizawa that she wishes to renege on her arranged betrothal. Emiko visits Serizawa in his creepy, vaguely gothic laboratory, intending to confess her love for another. Serizawa, however, makes his own confession. He has developed a device called the oxygen destroyer that is vastly more powerful even than nuclear bombs. Serizawa is racked with guilt over his creation of such a potent technology, and he fears that his discovery will fall into the wrong hands and be used as a weapon. Emiko vows to keep Serizawa's oxygen destroyer a secret, yet later, after she witnesses firsthand the devastation wrought by Godzilla, she realizes that the device could be used to kill the monster. Emiko and Ogata convince Serizawa that destroying Godzilla with the doctor's fearsome invention is humanity's only salvation. Conveniently, Godzilla sleeps by day at the bottom of Tokyo Bay, and Ogata and Serizawa, all rigged up in deep-sea diving gear, carefully place the oxygen destroyer next to the napping monster. Ogata returns to the surface, but Dr. Serizawa does not. He cuts his oxygen cord in a symbolic act of harakiri and falls to the bottom of the bay to die by Godzilla, taking his awesome secret, the formula for the oxygen destroyer, with him to his watery grave. In the end, the people of Japan mourn the sacrifice of Serizawa and continue to fear the unintended consequences of nuclear testing, but rejoice in the demise of Godzilla. And indeed, some commentators have read the self-congratulatory celebrations at the end of the film as a symbolic and therapeutic rewriting of the end of World War II. And in this version, of course, Japan emerges triumphant over its enemies. In any case, This first Godzilla film clearly had a strong anti-nuclear message. It had a moral which the director was trying to get across. Yet it becomes increasingly hard to conclude that the films have had a consistent message over time, especially since the series has now spanned a full 50 years. Over the decades, several of the Godzilla offerings have tried to tackle timely social issues: pollution, corporate greed, even school bullying. And Godzilla's advice on school bullying is pretty simple. If somebody is giving it to you at school, just beat the fertilizer out of them. The majority of the movies, however, have passed on social commentary in favor of good old crowd-pleasing entertainment value. Thus, I would suggest that there is no single moral we can take away from the Godzilla films, no overriding deep inner meaning, but instead only certain themes and tendencies we see recurring in the series over time. I might even go one step further and say that the only constant about the Godzilla films is a deep ambivalence, a kind of moral and intellectual ambiguity that precludes drawing any firm unitary conclusions. The message of Godzilla, if any, is complex and reflects, I believe, a fundamental ambivalence on the part of the Japanese when they look at issues like modernity, technology, science, nature, politics, and the world outside Japan. Let me just briefly then enumerate some of these themes which I think characterize the Godzilla films. First, through the Godzilla series, beginning with the 1954 Gojira, we see a fairly consistent expression of anti-American sentiments, and at the same time, a strong sense of pride in Japan and Japanese accomplishments. And this film, King Kong vs. Godzilla from 1963, is a good example of this. It was very much marketed as a showdown between America and Japan. And for a long time, the myth was prevalent that two endings to this movie were filmed. One for Japan, in which Godzilla wins, one for America, in which King Kong wins. In fact, there was only one ending, and it was a draw. Though really, King Kong maybe had slightly the upper hand in that one. Well, the original film back in 1954, of course, seeks to draw on the audience's memories of World War II and makes explicit reference to both the atomic bombings and to U.S. nuclear testing. Indeed, throughout Gojira, memories of the past war and fears of a coming war are seamlessly intertwined, always with an unspoken sense of antagonism towards America. In the following clip, for example, we see a group of commuters chatting in a train prior to Godzilla's attacks.
原子マグロと放射能雨だ。その上今度はゴジラと来たわ。東京湾で曲がり込んできたら一体どうなるの？
まず真っ先に君なんか狙われる口だね。
嫌なこった。せっかく長崎の原爆から命拾いしてきた大切な体なんだもの。
そろそろ疎開先でも探すとするかな。
私にもどっか探しといてよ。
ああ、また疎開か。まったく嫌だな。
Those of you who speak Japanese will see the subtitles here are not terribly good. The reference to Nagasaki gets lost in these subtitles. Clearly, though, we see this connection with the atomic bombings, connection with the World War II experience of going to the shelters, the sense of it happening to Japan all over again. The 1954 Gojira also has the air of a morality play of sorts, ending with the victory of Japan and Japanese science over the monster. The moral dimension of Japan's triumph pivots, of course, on Dr. Serizawa and his principled act of ultimate self-sacrifice. The apocalyptic fruits of Japanese science, the film bids us to conclude, would only be used for noble ends, for the preservation of humankind. And this starkly contrasts, of course, with America's mastery of the atom and its inhumane use of atomic technology in 1945. In short, Gojira tells us Japanese use of science good, American use of science bad. These themes come out particularly nicely and obviously in a 1991 film, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, where we are presented with the image of Godzilla actually fighting during World War II on the Japanese side. Okay. As unlikely as this may seem, that movie presents a new genesis myth for Godzilla, where Godzilla was a dinosaur living on a South Pacific island. This island is occupied by Japanese Marines during the war. American troops land, attempting to take the island over. The Japanese Marines are fighting off the American attackers when suddenly out of the jungle appears this huge dinosaur. Okay? The dinosaur roars, the dinosaur stomps on American soldiers, the Americans run away. Okay. Subsequently then, that island becomes an atomic testing site, Godzilla is created, and so forth and so on. It's truly a remarkable spectacle seeing in a Japanese film in 1991 the monster attacking American soldiers. And this film was so hot politically at the time, there were complaints by American veterans groups that it was not released in the US for several years. Theme number 2. As most fans of the series will have noticed, Godzilla changes over time from being an enemy of Japan, which the monster clearly is in the first movie, to being a defender and champion of Japan against legions of other monsters, credulity-stretching aliens, and even residents of a reclusive undersea civilization. Godzilla, in fact, seems to become Japanese over time. Less an outsider than part of Wareware Nihonjin, we Japanese. As the historian Yoshikuni Igarashi has persuasively argued, Godzilla's defanging reflected larger transitions in Japanese society. Quote, in 1960s Japan, a place overflowing with optimism, inspired by economic growth, the monsters could not find a place other than as caricatures. The darkness that prevailed in the first two films in the mid-1950s had vanished from the screen and from Japanese society. In other words, in a reconstructed, growing, increasingly self-confident post-war Japan, audiences, prepubescent as well as adult, had no interest in seeing a creature knock down Tokyo Tower, new highways, or the budding skyline, the very symbols of Japan's economic revival. Instead, Godzilla was tamed and transformed. He was made into a hometown superhero, a guardian of post-war Japan's prosperity. Yet really, and this is where the ambivalence comes in, Godzilla is never entirely friendly and protective. He is always surprisingly hostile towards Japan. And he never, of course, can truly become Japanese. He's always alien himself, an unpredictable other. Even if fresh from saving Japan from hostile invaders, some deep genetic programming keeps even the benevolent Godzilla from taking the shortest, least populated route back to the sea. After a busy day of vanquishing outsized enemies, Godzilla always seems to have enough energy before that long swim home to Monster Island to drag his big, scaly feet through the nearest urban area. Theme number 3. Japanese vulnerability. This, of course, is a constant theme in the Godzilla films, reflecting a similar strand in the Japanese popular imagination. Godzilla is portrayed from that original 1954 feature on as an unpredictable, uncontrollable force of nature, much like the earthquakes, volcanoes, typhoons, and tidal waves that batter a helpless Japan. Moreover, the Godzilla series also seems to reflect a sense of vulnerability to international political and economic forces beyond Japan's control. The Cold War, the oil shocks of the 1970s, protectionism, Japan bashing, and so forth. Even in the 1980s and early 1990s, when Japan appeared headed for global economic dominance, the theme of Japanese vulnerability persisted in the Heisei Godzilla series, although the moral valence of this vulnerability gradually began to change. In the films made during the go-go bubble economy, Japan sometimes seemed less an innocent victim than a victim of its own success. No longer compelling as radiation-made flesh or a cinematic metaphor of wartime suffering, Godzilla was transformed in the Heisei series into a conscience for Japan, an uncontrollable natural force that popped the bubble of Japan's inflated national pride. Tanaka Tomoyuki, the Toho Studios producer, was insistent that Godzilla trample the ostentatious landmarks of Japan's 1990s prosperity. The skyscrapers of Shinjuku, the glittering waterfront developments, the vain symbols of these abundant days, as Tanaka called them. Japan is rich and people can buy whatever they want, he explained. But what is behind that wealth? Nothing very spiritual. Everyone's so concerned with the material, and then Godzilla comes and rips it all apart. I suspect that is good for us to see. Theme number 4. In common with most works of science fiction, whether Japanese or Western, the attitudes towards science and technology revealed in the Godzilla movies also appear to be quite ambivalent. There clearly is an anti-science theme. Godzilla is the result of science gone wrong. There are anti-pollution, pro-environment messages in many of the films, and there are plenty of mad, evil scientists running around. Godzilla himself also often appears to be anti-progress. He trashes cities, he destroys industrial areas, and he just about always manages to trample Japan's most modern and impressive real estate developments. Godzilla does occasionally trash the repositories of Japanese tradition, like Kyoto, but he seems especially drawn to the flashy, the modern, and the industrial. Why? Is this a message against development, economic growth, and technology? Or is it just because it looks cool? As an aside, I should note, Japanese cities have come to take being destroyed by Godzilla as a mark of civic pride. In the late 1980s, several cities that had been overlooked across the years by Toho Studios actively petitioned to have Godzilla come and destroy their towns. And in fact, some of these cities were successful, like Sapporo, in having their towns destroyed by Godzilla. Some of you may have also seen cartoons that were shown in Japan where Godzilla was used as a means of teaching geography. A little animated city, Godzilla would walk around a city destroying all the landmarks so you could see what was in a particular town. So there is something anti-science, anti-modern about Godzilla. But at the same time, the films often revolve around scientists and scientific discovery. And it is often the heroic efforts of dedicated researchers that save Japan from Godzilla. And we see this certainly in the original film. The films also stress the humanity of scientists, especially Japanese ones. Dr. Yamane shows a sympathy for the monster and yearns to study rather than destroy it, while Serizawa is tortured by the guilt of creating a superweapon. And so, as is typical in science fiction around the world, the overall impression of science and scientists ends up being rather ambiguous. Fifth and finally, and again, this is in common with the larger sci-fi genre, attitudes towards authority are highlighted in the Godzilla films. The movies consistently underline the weakness of traditional authority figures in times of crisis. Often the military, the government, and intellectuals appear impotent in the face of Godzilla's threat. And thus, the films seem to have a somewhat critical perspective on the establishment. The establishment can't always protect the people in these movies. At the same time, I think one could argue that the films really have a much darker subtext, and that their message is actually rather conservative, even reactionary. Godzilla, for instance, doesn't seem to be a great respecter of democratic values. Well, Godzilla himself usually tends to stay above the political fray, but there is a moment in the original 1954 Gojira when one wonders if the king of the monsters is trying to make a more explicit political statement. Near the beginning of the film, Dr. Yamane testifies to a diet committee, reporting on the theory that the monster is a direct result of nuclear testing. This incendiary revelation leads to a spirited debate amongst the parliamentarians. And this is a fairly long clip showing that debate.
その年度のガイガーカウンターによる放射能検出定量分析によるストロンチウム90の発見、後ほど田辺博士から詳しくご説明がありますが、つまりゴジラに付着していたこの砂の中に水爆の放射能を多量に発見することができたのであります。
正式に願います。正式に願います。
これらの物的根拠からしてゴジラも相当量の水爆放射性因子を帯びていると見ることができます。
正式に願います。ご正式に願います。
委員長、委員長、
大山委員、
ただいまの山根博士の報告は誠に重大でありまして、軽々しく公表すべきでないと思います。
何を言うか、重大だからこそ公表すべきだ。そうだそうだそうだそうだ。
黙れ。というのは、あのゴジラなる代物が水爆の実験が生んだ落とし子であるなどという。
その通りじゃないか。
そうだ。そんなことをそんなことを発表したら、ただでさえうるさい国際問題が一体どうなるか。
事実は事実だ。
だからこそ重大問題である。軽率に公表した暁は国民大衆を恐怖に陥れ、ひいて政治経済外交まで混乱を引き起こし。
バカ者、何を言うとるか。そうだ。
バカとは何てバカだ。それしろそれしろ。
事実は堂々と発表しろ。
Those of you familiar with Japanese politics in the 1950s will see this is quite an apt political caricature of the time. On the one side, you have conservatives in their cream-colored suits saying we must repress information. On the other side, we have the radicals, represented by these rather strident women, saying the truth is the truth and we must let it out there. In the end, they bicker endlessly, and from the looks on the scientists' faces, I think you can get a sense of the filmmaker's perspective. Politicians just fight, nothing good comes of it. Well, Godzilla adds his 2 cents worth a few nights later. In the midst of his second nighttime rampage through Tokyo, Godzilla comes upon the Diet Building. With no further ado, Godzilla proceeds to walk through rather than, of course, around the structure. His massive feet reducing one wing, very likely the exact spot where this debate earlier took place, into a pile of monumental rubble. But what is Godzilla's message in this deliberate destruction of the seat of Japanese democracy? Is there a message at all? Was the Diet Building, like the Empire State Building in King Kong, just a convenient landmark for the filmmakers to exploit? Or was Godzilla symbolically sticking one to the smarmy conservative politicians who tried, oh so unsuccessfully, to conceal his very existence? Or, most provocatively of all, might Godzilla have been rendering a judgment on democracy writ large, his actions a damning statement on the divisiveness, infighting, and ultimate impotence of democratic politics, and specifically of Japan's fractured post-war political system? Well, intriguingly, contemporary reports suggested that the audiences watched the 1954 film with a very somber, solemn air. Okay. Japanese audiences took the film seriously, and particularly at the end, many Japanese audiences were reported to have left theaters in tears. But many observers also noted that movie houses also broke into applause and cheering at one point in the screenings. The scene where Godzilla destroys the Diet Building. Now, the role of the military in the Godzilla films is also worth considering. I might even go so far as labeling the Godzilla series military pornography. The following is a very brief clip from the 1954 film Gojira. Keep in mind, this movie was made less than a decade after Japan's defeat in World War II, and only a few years after the promulgation of Japan's post-war peace constitution. The famous Article 9 of that constitution reads in part, quote, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. Land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained."
より同じく7分北緯33度4分より同じく8分を結ぶ海上においてゴジラに対しフリゲート艦隊によって爆雷攻撃を実施するにつき付近航行の船舶は十分なる注意を要します。終わり。
それだけですか？
終わり。
This scene, with its stirring military soundtrack, what I like to think of as pachinko parlor music, could have as easily come from a wartime propaganda film as from a 1950s anti-nuclear monster movie. This is what I consider to be military porn. The Godzilla movies allowed Japanese filmmakers to show the Japanese military in action in a positive light, despite the constitutional renunciation of war and a general tendency in society towards pacifism. As Donald Ritchie has written, quote, "The temper of the Japanese populace in the mid-1950s was such that no film which in any way favored rearmament could have been successful at the box office. Hence, none were made." Ritchie clearly didn't watch the Godzilla movies very closely, since Godzilla's very presence seems to provide sound, unthreatening justification for the Japanese military in the post-war period. Even if Japanese land, sea, and air forces proved, as they did in every single film, to be impotent against Godzilla, the very threat of monster attack provided a kind of legitimacy and a sense of urgency for Japanese remilitarization. And even if this seems a bit far-fetched to you, keep in mind that the Godzilla films were aimed largely at impressionable preteen children from the early 1960s on. One should also note that the pro-military theme has become even more overt in recent films, especially the remarkable 2001 offering Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, which is a virtual paean of praise to the Japanese self-defense forces. Well, with all this in mind, how in the end can we characterize Godzilla? Is Godzilla a subversive or a reactionary? Is Godzilla a rebel without a cause or a harsh social critic? An unpredictable natural disaster or the reptilian conscience of a materially wealthy but spiritually bankrupt Japan? Is Godzilla a harmless man in a rubber suit or a tool of right-wing indoctrination aimed at Japanese youth? This brings us back, I think, to the notions of ambivalence and ambiguity. Godzilla sends a mixed message. As both an enemy and a defender, both a force of nature and the product of high technology, as both an outsider and yet somehow truly Japanese, Godzilla was, in a way, like the larger processes of modernization and industrialization that post-war Japan was undergoing. Godzilla, like the modern world, was both a curse and a blessing, both something alien and something Japanese. Perhaps above all, Godzilla, like modern life, was inevitable and unavoidable, and Japan was forced to take the good with the bad in the decades after World War II. Thank you very much. The name of the North Korean version was Pulgasari, and I apologize for my pronunciation. Pulgasari. There were also South Korean versions of Godzilla made, which are equally hilarious but in a different way. And the one from the 1960s, I think, is named Yongari, also well worth seeing. The question is about how the films were promoted in Japan. Throughout the post-war period. Really, especially as the films are aimed at a younger audience, they really are promoted as kiddie films in many ways. And the promotional efforts decline over time. The first films are promoted very heavily because they're quite popular, and yet over time the audience is shrinking, the age is getting younger, and so the advertising is very much aimed at them. Tends to be quite unsophisticated, very colorful, emphasizing the action in the films, and not really any of the content within them. The content, the message, to the extent there is one, becomes secondary to the fighting. The Japanese theater owners, the people who showed these movies, in their feedback to Toho said, with 8-year-olds in the audience, you've got to have constant action. If we have 2 minutes of screen time without monsters fighting, the kids get bored and they start pulling the stuffing out of the seats. Okay? So we got to keep them fighting. Okay? And that's what they do in these later films. What I found interesting is this is exactly the same audience, the same message that theater owners catering to the pornographic trade were giving to their filmmakers. You have to have a sexual act every 2 minutes or else the people are going to leave. And so there's this weird balance there. The question is about whether a new series of Godzilla will come out in which China is the threat. I think it is very possible indeed. The question is, what role will the Japanese government take in this? Toho Studios and their relationship with the Japanese government has traditionally been very close. Toho was essentially an official studio during World War II that made propaganda films. It had very close relationships with the militarist government. And the recent films, they've worked very closely with the self-defense forces in producing these positive films. So I don't think we're going to see anything coming out of Toho that's too far from official policy. But if Japanese official policy towards China hardens, it'll be reflected in these as well. The question is, this movie came out about the time of the Korean War. There was much discussion at the time of potential use of the atomic bomb during the Korean War, and did that affect the making of this movie? I think definitely. This played into the sort of mood of nuclear anxiety that was particularly strong in Japan at the time. Certainly coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, amplified directly in this case by the Lucky Dragon incident, which really was very important in Japan. This was big news in Japan. Many Japanese stopped eating fish because they feared irradiation from these nuclear tests. It was even reported that the emperor stopped eating fish, which shocked the Japanese people and meant that it really was serious. And so when you figure in the Korean War as well, there definitely was this societal anxiety that this movie plays upon very effectively. You know, people were crying at the end because it hit some kind of a chord. That is definitely one of them. Well, the question basically is an observation from the 1960s movie Godzilla versus the Thing, where in the Japanese version we have the Japanese self-defense forces attacking the monster, but in the American re-editing of it, we have new footage added of American Navy units using missiles on the monster. And what does this say about the relationship? You know, many Japanese critics have commented on the fact that despite the presence of the Mutual Security Treaty between Japan and the United States, the American military forces stationed in Japan never in these films come to the rescue of the Japanese and never fight the monsters. Now, I've read the Mutual Security Treaty. It does not mention monsters in there specifically. So I think maybe on a technicality, the U.S. forces get out. And yet, it's a good point. You know, and part of this maybe sort of implicit jab at the Americans and the idea that Japan cannot rely on the Americans for protection. The Japanese somehow have to be self-sufficient. And the fact that this was added in the American version does show, I think, a certain American sensitivity to the fact that watching the Japanese fight the monsters is somehow not satisfying. That it only really has credibility as a horrible threat to humanity if the American Navy takes it on and fails. Okay. So I think there really are some complicated international dynamics in play there. The question basically here is about the urban politics of the films and whether the filmmakers were responding to the rural-urban divide in Japan, which was still very strong in the 1950s. There was a lot of hostility amongst country dwellers about this rise of the cities over time. I think that's a very interesting observation and really not something I had thought about. Certainly, Godzilla's swath of destruction through Tokyo in the original film is quite broad, even broader than American fire bombings during World War II. One critic at the time noted that Godzilla walked into Tokyo and only one thing turned him back, and that was the Imperial Palace. That he got as far as the moat and said, enough, I'll go back to the ocean. And in fact, that is one place that's sacred in all of the films. Needless to say, the Imperial Palace never gets stomped on by Godzilla.
Does he go up against the torii anywhere? As sort of amuletic?
That's a good question, which I'd have to think about a little bit. I can't remember that he does. You know, some of the symbols of Japan's urban growth in the 50s and 60s are shown in later movies. Tokyo Tower becomes a very powerful prop in later movies, and yet it isn't really, you know, destroyed in the same reckless fashion as some of the landmarks in the original one. Thank you very much.